can you pass these out for me, these handouts? If you're watching us online, Facebook, there is a link that posted about 6:30 to the handout if you would like to follow us along with the handout. Once again, I'd like to remind you that we have an Instagram page at KOK Conroe. If you haven't followed it, please do so. We have a Facebook page at King of Kings Conroe, and we have a website, kokconroe.com. And we have a YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please go look for it at KOK Conroe and subscribe. You will find Brother Will's message and Brother Caleb's message there individually to watch. And what, Jamie? Oh, okay. And our live streams are also on there, but we'll be getting some more content on that channel soon. First of all, let me state that I'm not a farmer. I'm not a gardener. I do not have a green thumb. If anybody knows me, they know that I have a hard time keeping a silk plant alive. When I go to Hobby Lobby or Michael's or somewhere where they have those big green silk plants, I'm like, these are the kind I like. These are the kind I can keep alive. Now, my daddy's mother, my grandmother, she had a green thumb. My dad had a green thumb, and it skipped me, and now my daughter, Elena, has the green thumb. They're always growing stuff. They're always talking about their vegetables and things that they're growing, and they grow flowers. And I know that her and my dad and my grandmother, they tried different ways to grow things and tried in different kinds of soil, because sometimes the soil you plant in just doesn't yield a good harvest. You know, I know one time my husband planted a garden and it just had too much acid or something in the soil and it just didn't produce anything. Sometimes your soil just isn't good. And I was listening to a gardener talking about how their garden wasn't producing well, so they decided to have a soil test done to test the soil. And when they got the results back, their soil was lacking some basic nutrients that the plants needed to grow. And they had to figure out how to get those basic nutrients into their soil in order for their plants to grow and be nourished. And this professional also suggested to them something called no-till gardening. Has anybody ever heard of that? Miss Elena, because she watches all the gardening YouTube videos and everything. No-till gardening. So instead of pulling up the old plants and then tilling the soil, no-till gardening says to cut off the plants at the ground and leave all of the old root systems in place under the soil. The reason is that these roots are creating an ecosystem underneath. Underneath the soil is this ecosystem, and there are different organisms that latch onto these roots so that they can live and grow by consuming the roots that are now dying. And as it decays, it actually becomes food for future growth. It becomes food for the future health of your garden. Now, this isn't a gardening class, I promise. I'm going somewhere with it, though. Not every garden is the same, but there are some elements of every garden that are the same. And in our lives spiritually, and especially since we've been talking about what it means to experience genius in different areas of our life, there's no one size fits all. You know, you remember those little moo-moo gowns you could get that was one size fits all? Well, there's no one size fits all on this, but there are elements that each of us need in our lives in order to grow. And I believe discovering your genius is the same. We don't all have the same genius. When I look around this room tonight, I see a lot of different geniuses. We don't all have the same genius, but there are elements of genius that are the same within each one of us. There's elements of your genius that I can learn from, and there's elements of my genius that you can learn from. And we all grow together as we understand each other's genius. So this is the graph. Last week, we kicked off this series by talking about where our genius comes from, and it comes from our history, our personality, our passions, and our gifts. And where all of these things come together and intersect, that's where we find our genius. Last week, we looked into the life of Joseph, who's the son of Jacob. We looked at Israel and Egypt and how the destiny of two nations was changed because of Joseph leaning into his genius through suffering and discovering an emotional intelligence that really changed everything. We looked into the Old Testament last week, and this week I want to look at the New Testament at the Apostle Paul. And we're going to uncover a genius that I think is overlooked and undervalued in all of our lives, and especially in Paul. And that is the genius of vulnerability. We often view vulnerability as a weakness, and it certainly can be a weakness, but it's only a weakness if it's not used as a tool that moves us forward in our spiritual journey and in our personal journey towards wholeness and wellness. It's a critical component of the healthy ecosystem of the soul, of the mind, and of the emotions. Vulnerability with your insecurities, with your triggers, with your anxieties, with your doubts and fears. Vulnerability with your anger and what makes you angry. And there is a high probability that there's an area in your life right now that you need to get vulnerable with. That vulnerability is the only way that you're going to move toward the soul wellness that God has designed for you to experience. You see, faith without vulnerability isn't a fully formed faith. So what does it look like? The genius of vulnerability is you, say me. It's you accepting agency over what you have experienced, what has been done to you, what you think about yourself and what you have experienced, and using that by taking it through vulnerability to a place of wholeness and health. Healthy vulnerability includes 5 things that we're going to look at tonight. It's certainly not a complete list, but these 5 things are critical for us to be able to experience healthy vulnerabilities. There are healthy vulnerabilities. You don't just go around being vulnerable all the time and just exposing yourself and all your weaknesses to everybody you see. But there's a healthy vulnerability, and we want to learn from the Apostle Paul, who lived with a healthy vulnerability. The first thing, number 1, is vulnerability requires brutal honesty. Brutal honesty. And brutal honesty with yourself. Paul was a victim, and Paul was a victimizer. Paul experienced abandonment. He experienced abuse. He experienced doubt, and he experienced abandonment by those who followed him. He dealt with insecurity. He experienced fear. He was lied to. He was betrayed. He was overwhelmed. But Paul modeled honesty with himself. Romans 7:15, he talks about his inner struggle with himself and with sin. When he said, you all know this, the things I don't want to do, I do. And the things I want to do, I don't do. He talked about that. He exposed what that struggle was in itself, and he was honest about it. He didn't say, I got it all together and I'm doing all things right. He said, no, I'm struggling here. I've got a thorn in the flesh. 2 Corinthians 12:7, he opens up about his thorn in the flesh and his struggle with it. And he was honest, and he talked about how it annoyed him, and he talked about how it bothered him and how he asked God to take it away. He asked God to move it. And what did God do? Did he take it? No. He said to him, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. He didn't take it away, but Paul was honest about it. And you know the thing that keeps frustrating you in your life? The thing that keeps bothering you, the thing that isn't that thing, it isn't the problem. It's the thing beneath the thing that is most likely the issue. Until we step back and get really honest with ourselves, we cannot become a healthy ecosystem. Because facts, the only person you can't escape is who? You. Wherever I go, there I am. And you will never be able to lead yourself well if you continue to lie to yourself and to ignore the things that keep popping up their ugly little heads in your life. And there's one common denominator in every bad decision that I've ever made. And I look at her every morning in the mirror. Every morning, it's me. It's the common denominator in everything that we've experienced. And I must be willing to make the commitment to myself that I will be brutally honest with myself no matter how much it hurts. because it's painful to be honest with yourself. Honest about my hurts, honest about my wounds from others, honest about my insecurities, honest about the hurts that I've caused in others, honest about the hard conversations I've avoided, the controlling experiences I've had, the times I've bailed on situations and people. And this is scary. I mean, this is real. Getting into this place of honesty is not easy. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But you can't heal what you don't reveal. You can't heal it. It's just going to stay there and fester until you decide to reveal it. I love this learning zone model. It shows this image of starting in a place of comfort, right? The reddish part. You're in a place of comfort. And then it ends in the last circle of growth. But in order to grow, in order to get to grow, you've got to go through the next zone, which is fear. And you always have to step into the fear zone to get to the learning zone, to get to the growth zone. You have to go through all of these zones in order to grow. But you will never get to that space of growing unless you're willing to deal with some of the fears that are there and expose the fears and the hurts and the doubts and, yes, even the trauma. But then what needs to happen is in that moment, we need to become curious about it. We need to start asking the questions. My husband tells me all the time I ask too many questions because I'm curious. I want to know how things work and why do you do it that way. And I remember even as a young woman, someone was changing a tire for me, and I asked all the questions about how do you do this? How do you turn those lugs? How do you do that? Why did I do that, Tina? Because in my mind, I thought I may have to do this one day by myself. There may not be a man around, and I may have to get myself out here and learn how to do this so I can do it. But we need to become curious, and we need to ask questions. Why is this here? Why does this hurt me, to be honest with myself? To be honest about my insecurities. Why is this hurting me? And you know what? When we start getting honest and we start asking these questions about our traumas, about our fears, about our insecurities, you know what always happens? Always. Other ones pop up, right? Ones you weren't even thinking about. They pop up. Because life would be great, wouldn't it? If it wasn't for all the people. If it wasn't for that girl that gets on my last nerve. If it wasn't for that man that every time I see him, he says something irritating to me and sets me off. If it wasn't for all the people, it would be great. When we realize that a lot of our insecurities, and when we begin to look at the thing below the thing as to why something bothered us, it's usually not the person we're dealing with in that moment. It's usually a past experience with somebody. If I'm upset with Tina right now, it's probably not even her that I'm upset with. It's probably something that happened in the past that triggered me to be upset. All those things have to do with what we find other people there, their words, their actions, their perceptions of us, and even our perception of what their actions said about us. But you can't get there unless you start with brutal honesty. Then when you get to brutal honesty, the second phase of healthy vulnerability is ferocious forgiveness. Over and over and over and over again. Ferocious forgiveness. Paul, who was thrown in prison, abandoned by disciples. His motives were questioned by the Philippian church. He was beaten to the point that they thought he was dead. That's how bad he was beaten. Talk about trauma. Paul had to have some serious trauma. And yet he writes in 2 Corinthians 2:10, forgive one another. Forgive one another as your Father has forgiven you. He writes again the same thing in Ephesians 4:32, and he writes it yet again in Colossians 3:13. Over and over again, Paul models what vulnerability looks like. And part of that is this ferocious forgiveness that I'm talking about. Forgiveness of the thing beneath the thing. Now we're going to look at the letters tonight in the word thing, and you can see that on your sheet. The T stands for trigger. The trigger is the setup that sets you off. The setup that sets you off. And then when that happens, the H happens, the hideouts. That's where we go to hide from the pain. We all have different hideouts. We all have different ones, but we all have hideouts. Some of us hide out into food. There's nothing that a gallon of Bluebell ice cream can't fix. Nothing. And you can look at me and tell that my hideout is food. And that Bluebell ice cream, that's the thing right there. Some of us hide out into music. Maybe some of us hide out into entertainment. Maybe some of us hide out into alcohol. What is the hideout? It's some form of escapism. It's some form of protection. It's where you can go to feel safe. And when we get that trigger, we move to the hideout because we want to hide out. And then all of a sudden, the I stands for insecurities. All of a sudden, our insecurities are exposed. And this is one of the best definitions I've ever heard of insecurities. Insecurities are the false stories that you create about yourself. Do you know that most of your insecurities are completely lies? They're false. I've had some of the most beautiful women that I've known think they're so insecure and they don't feel pretty and they feel like that they're always ugly. They're too fat. Their face is too round or too square. Their thighs are too big. There's always something, some insecurities. They're false things, false stories that we create about ourselves. We look in the mirror and, oh, my nose is too big. My jaws are sagging. Mine are. That's not a lie. This is not a false story. But I'm not insecure about it. It's a part of aging. But we make up these insecurities, these stories, these false stories we create about ourselves. I look back on journals that I had when I was 13, 14 years old. I weighed 135 pounds, and that's not much for a 5'7" tall woman. I was very thin. But I told myself all the time in my journals, I am so fat. I have got to lose weight. I'm going to start jogging today. I mean, it was always something about the weight. And God, I wished I weighed 135 pounds, you know. But I had some false stories I told myself, some insecurities. And then N stands for narratives. And the narratives are the false stories you create about others. You see, we begin to create stories about others, right? And we box people in. We hear one thing and then all of a sudden we attach them to an entire narrative. And that's what happens a lot of times when we have these trigger experiences. Something happens and all of a sudden that little emotion that popped up, it's just a little tiny thing. Maybe we felt a little jealous or a little something, and then all of a sudden we've written a whole narrative. We've written a whole narrative. It puts you into the cause of that narrative. We write a story. We write a story. I've dealt with young people especially over the years, and one will be like, they were over in that corner talking about me. I saw them. Did you hear what they were saying? No, but I know they were talking about me because they were looking over at me. And so, you know, I kind of went over to see, and they weren't talking about that young person at all, but because they had wrote a narrative. They wrote a narrative. It was wrong, and they wrote it. But this narrative, we write these stories, but it ends in this place of healing, which is the word grace. And grace is the place where you discover how to become whole, holy, and spiritually healthy. Healthy vulnerability is getting real with yourself, about yourself, so that you can heal yourself. You can't heal if you don't get honest and if you don't get real about yourself. If we're being triggered, it's usually connected to an old wound. And this is an opportunity that God loves us so much that he will keep bringing people into our lives until we honor this pain. He loves us that much. He's going to keep bringing the people that irritate us in that one spot into our life. They'll have a different face. They'll look different. They'll have a different name, but it'll be the same person. It'll be the same aggravating trait that just drives you up the wall. He'll keep bringing them into your life until you honor this wound, this pothole truth. And then when you do that, you're going to be able to invite grace in and become a better human being. We become well, and we can truthfully say, it is well with my soul. You see, the life you wish you had is often found in the work that you're avoiding. Let me say that again. The life you wish you had is often found in the work that you're avoiding. That's true at work, but that's true in your personal life, in your spiritual life, in your growth as a person, even emotionally. The hard work is the work of honesty. When we say in recovery meetings that we're putting in hard work, it is hard work to put in that honesty. It's the work of forgiveness that we're talking about, because it's hard work. And here's the thing. Forgiveness is not about the other person. It's not about the person that you need to forgive. That's one of the biggest myths, one of the biggest misunderstandings of what forgiveness is, because forgiveness is all about you. Say, it's about me. You have control over it. I'm telling you, unforgiveness is like an acid that eats its own container. If you pour acid into a container, it will eat a hole in that container. So do yourself a favor and forgive. Stepping into forgiveness is all about you moving into a place of healing. I know there's so many layers to this, and most of the time we're going to need help to walk through it. Most of the time you can't walk through this stuff alone. You might need the help of a book. Life's Healing Choices. It's a book. It might be the help of a class or a course. It might be the help of a counselor or a recovery group. And I've tapped into all of these at different points in my life. Don't be afraid to tap into a group or a book or a counselor. But here's my point. No matter what your experience is, no matter what your trauma is, you can be healed. You can forgive. There might be something you're thinking about right now that you say, I can't forgive that person. I never will. You can. You can forgive. It is within you through Christ to move into a place of wholeness, of health, of wellness, and of healing. And I know it's hard to imagine, but you can find wellness, and the ecosystem of your soul can become well. You may even need to experience some of that no-till gardening in who you are, because there's some things in your life that used to produce that aren't producing anymore, and they need to be cut off. They need to be cut off. There's some things in your life that were difficult experiences, but you know what? The roots of that, as they decay, they can become a healthy component of you growing and moving forward. Why am I even talking about this? Because I think that all of us have some area of our life where we are living from hurt. We're living from a wound, from an insecurity. And when it pops up, maybe through a short temper, or through a sharp word, or through a moment of needing to escape, maybe a breakdown or a meltdown, we don't take advantage of that moment to be vulnerable with ourselves. We just brush it off like, it's your fault because you pushed me. It's your fault because you triggered me, because you created the environment for me to respond like that. But what we need to do is, like I said, get curious in that moment, get vulnerable in that moment and say, what's going on underneath here? What is the thing beneath the thing? This emotion iceberg, it gives you an example with the emotion of anger. So you see anger on the top, that's what you see. But look at the thing beneath the thing. Look at the thing beneath the anger. There's fear, there's stress, biology, past experiences, what someone did, what someone said. All of these things are the thing beneath the thing. You may see someone acting out in anger. You may see someone getting drunk, battling alcohol. Alcohol is just a symptom. It's not the problem. Drugs are a symptom. They're not the problem. They're a symptom. It's the thing. It's this thing beneath the thing that's the problem. Why did I act like that with my kids? Why did I just yell at my spouse? Why did I act like that to my parents or with my teacher or my friends? What is it? What's going on here? What is the thing beneath the thing? So Paul, he models honesty with ourselves for us, and he models forgiveness. And number 3, Paul models for us a genius of vulnerability with a recovered identity. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And I will all the more gladly boast of my weakness, that the power of Christ may rest on." You see, Paul is identifying here with Christ. He's identifying with him. Galatians 2:20, he said, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." He's identifying with Christ in 1 Corinthians 13:10. "For now I know in part, but then I shall know fully as I am known." The last part of that verse is so interesting because Paul says being known or knowing in full is in direct proportion to being fully known by God. How many of you wants to be known by God? Known. You see, vulnerability has to do with being known. And you can only know as you are known by God. Now, we all say, well, God knows me. He knows all about me. He knows all my flaws. He knows all the good things about me. He knows all about me. But God knowing about you and knowing you is different than being known. Because being known involves two people. One person can't known. One person can't known. You can't known somebody. It has to be two people for there to be a known experience. Being known is you knowing me, but me knowing that you know me and us having that mutual experience of knownness. So God is trying to reveal to you who you are so that you can be known by him. When I went through my own desert experience and I went through the hard work of vulnerability and uncovering the thing beneath the thing, and I began to find these insecurities, and I was asking myself, why do I feel that? Why does this make me so mad? Why does this make me so sad? And I began to uncover the insecurity, and I tied it to conversations. I tied it to experiences in my life, and I tied it to what somebody said to me. And now every time that I have that experience, I repeat that narrative over to myself. And I speak those words back, or I listen to myself saying these things about myself. So when I went through this work of vulnerability, I began to discover who he saw me to be. And then I began to see myself in that light, and I began to transform. So as I was known by God, then I knew who I was. And it wasn't the first time. I was coming home. I was coming home to who I had always been. But Janie, I hadn't been there in so long that I forgot who I was. I forgot who I was. You ever been in such a dark desert place that you forget who you are? It's like Brother Caleb was talking about me talking to him when he was in a dark place. And I said, you need to realize who you are. You are a man of God. Sometimes we forget who we are when we get into a dark desert place. You just get used to being in that dry, discontented place that you just accept it. You get used to it. But I was coming home to who I was meant to be. And being known by God in those moments revealed to me and helped me come back to a recovered identity of who I was created to be. You see, God knew me and he knew you before we even knew our own selves. The Bible says that he knew me before I was even formed in my mother's womb. He already knew me. And it's only through experiencing this knownness of God that you can know who you truly are. And it was an identity that I had let other people steal from me. How do we do that? Because of what they said or what they did or how they made me feel about myself. I let them steal it from me. And then I kept listening to that narrative over my life and my identity. And that's when I finally realized I needed to stop listening to myself and start talking to myself. I needed to flip the script. I needed to rewrite the narrative, and I needed to tell myself what I knew that God knew about me. And I don't know who this is for today. It's for some of you here. But somebody needs to tell themselves something that God says about them. You need to tell yourself Isaiah 54, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. I don't care what they try to do to me. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. You need to tell yourself Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. You need to tell yourself Romans 8:38, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. You need to tell yourself, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things. You need to tell yourself Job 13, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I will trust him. If he decides to kill me today and it's my last day on earth, I'm still going to trust him. Somebody tell yourself something that God's telling you about yourself. The genius of vulnerability involves brutal honesty, ferocious forgiveness, recovered identity, and number 4, trusted circles. When's the last time you checked your circle? The people that you surround yourself is your circle. When was the last time you checked it? Because you know what? This thing we're doing here, this getting vulnerable, it's no solo endeavor. You can't do this by yourself. Successful self-leadership means I will not lead myself by myself. We need people who will speak truth into our lives, but people that we trust their values. We need safe spaces, but we need trusted spaces. Because the Bible says faithful are the wounds of a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. When's the last time you had somebody whose values you trusted that wounded you with a word to move you toward wholeness? When is the last time a trusted friend wounded you with a word that was for your own good and that was to better you? If it hasn't been for a minute, then maybe you need to check your circle. Because if you're surrounded by yes men and yes women, you're not going to go very far. Because see, the problem is, as people, we tend to build our circles by interest and not values. We tend to build our circles by, oh, you like to make quilts? So do I. Let's get together and hang out. It doesn't matter that you have no values and you have the morals of a barnyard cat. We have similar interests. Oh, you like to fish? Yeah, man, let's go fishing. It doesn't matter that you won't come to church. It doesn't matter that you're not faithful to the house of God. You like to fish. So see, we have a tendency to create circles by interest and not values. So check your circle. See if your circle is being created by values. And if it's not, maybe you need to make some adjustments to your circle. The genius of vulnerability also involves an outward purpose. I'm afraid the trend and the tide of our culture these days is about self-discovery, right? I got to go on a trip to find myself. I got to get away from my husband for a week so I can find myself, so I can discover myself. I'm afraid that's the trend of our culture. A self-discovery that points inward as an end unto itself. But you see, self-discovery in its healthy form starts at the Creator and it goes outward. It starts with who God says I am, and then it goes outward from there. Because if all you do is get to know yourself for yourself, when you get to the end, all you're going to have is yourself. That's all you're going to have. Listen to me tonight. People want to know their purpose. People want to know their purpose. It's one of the things we talk about millennials. You know, people get down on millennials a lot, saying, you know, they're just kind of aimless. But they are the most purpose-driven people that are alive today. They want something to believe in. They want a purpose. That's why they're going out and joining these terrorist groups, because it's something they can believe in. They want to believe in something, and if we don't share with them what we know about the Word of God and about Jesus Christ, they can't believe in it because they're unchurched. The majority of them, their parents never took them to church. They don't know anything about the Bible. So we have to help. What is my purpose? If I ask for a show of hands, I doubt there'd be one hand left not up. Have you ever asked yourself, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Let me tell you one of my favorite definitions of purpose, and it's that purpose is found just across the border of what's in it for me. We always want to know what's in it for me. Oh, you want me to be a Sunday school teacher? Well, what's in it for me? Am I going to get an award if I'm the best teacher? What's in it for me? You see, vulnerability has to lead to a place that starts inward, but it points outward. This is not self-discovery for self's sake. This is self-discovery of who God says I am for others' sake. For others' sake, so that I can share this gospel with others. If I'm so wrapped up in my own self all the time, when am I going to reach out to my coworker? When am I going to reach out to my neighbor? When am I going to reach out to my cousin? If I'm all wrapped up in myself all the time and all I can think about is my problems, us four and no more. Me and my pitiful self. I love me. I love myself. I've got my picture on a shelf. Enough about me. You, let's talk about me. We've got to get out of ourselves. And that was the model that Jesus lived for us. Purpose isn't necessarily something pretty either. If we go back to 2 Corinthians 12, and we talked about this earlier, it said that Paul asked God to remove the thorn in the flesh. But God didn't take it away. Instead, he said, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. When you start getting into vulnerability and you start exposing some things that have really gone awry in your life and that have got you to this point, when you start crying, Tina, it's not no pretty little sweet cry. It's ugly crying. It's ugly crying. This can get really ugly, but it has to get there in order for you to get to grow. What if the purpose of the trauma, of the wound that you've experienced, what if the purpose of the loss, what if the purpose is that the world would know, that you would know that God is enough, that his grace is enough, that he is sufficient. You know, Job was a perfect man. He didn't do anything wrong. And you think, well, he had to do something wrong. He lost all his wife, his kids, his wealth, his riches. No, God was showing the devil. He was teaching the devil a lesson. He wasn't teaching Job a lesson. Sometimes we're going through things and it's for something else. It's not for what we think it is. No matter what, you're going to be okay because God is with you. His grace is sufficient for you. And for others to experience that as you are vulnerable and share your wound. You see, finding your genius involves moving through the genius of vulnerability and then realizing that your genius has an outward purpose. Your genius, all of you are sitting on genius here tonight. And it's not for you to get rich with. It's an outward purpose. And it's okay if you get rich as long as you give to the Lord. I'm not against getting rich. But you need to realize that your genius has an outward purpose. As we close this lesson today, I want to extend an invitation to you today to come home. Come home. It's an invitation to come home to you. It's to come home to God. It's to come home to the you that he knew before you were even born. It's to come home to your soul. It's to come home to wellness. I invite you this week to find a place somewhere where you can get vulnerable, where you can get vulnerable with yourself and with God, and you can come home to the you that he created you to be. How many would like to be the you that God created you to be before life started happening, before hurt started happening, before regret started piling on? God created each and every one of you to be a miraculous person. He said we're all fearfully and wonderfully made. He made us that way. So he's inviting us today to come home to who he created us to be. Thank you, Pastor.